Limited banners are weird. They have the best odds for an on-banner unit, but the odds of actually getting a specific unit is only 35%, barely more than your run-of-the-mill standard banner. So sometimes you go in for the fun and flashy limited unit, only to end up with like 4 Hul Hayaks. And those non-limited 6 stars have a hard time of it, being at best a consolation prize and at worst a reminder of how you missed out on who you really wanted. Of course, some units escape this, usually because they just have so much damage that it's impossible to ignore. But for every Logos, you have 3 Lees, Vivianas, or now Blazes. And even after their initial banner is over, that reputation remains so strong that anyone who might get them later and look into whether or not they should raise that unit has very little chance of actually getting to see the character's value. I've seen a lot of varying opinions on Yu, from people pointing at his S3 and the drone casters and saying he's a must pull, to others pointing at future banners and saying you should skip him. But for Blaze, it seems like just about everyone had already made up their minds about her before she even released. And if the popular opinion is to be believed, she's just a bad unit that relies too much on other operators and who specifically needs a limited character to even be passable. Now, you can probably guess that I disagree, but instead of just taking my word for it, let's go over her kit as it functions for her on her own, as well as how she works with you and the other burn units, so you can decide for yourself how she'd fit into your roster. Blaze the Igniting Spark is a primal caster, specifically a burn element primal caster, meaning by default her attacks deal arts damage, but her skills and talents let her apply burn status and elemental damage to those under the status, but notably not necessarily both at once. This is where the talk of her needing synergies comes from, and it's something that's been repeated for each of the primal casters that have released. But Blaze actually plays with this restriction in a pretty notable way, and she does that with her first talent. And, whoa, segue, that first talent is, when an enemy suffers a burn status effect, Blaze immediately deals 380% of her attack at potential 5, or 350% without that potential, as elemental damage, and recovers 15% of her max HP, or again 12% without that same potential. This might seem familiar to Warmy users, as it's a much stronger and more flexible version of her talent. In fact, it'll seem pretty familiar to anyone who uses any of the primal casters, as all of them, minus Diamante, have a variation of this, though I personally like Blaze's application of it the most. For one, Blaze's version of the talent typically deals the most damage, and they added a whole new effect to it, letting those burn statuses heal Blaze, which will become relevant in her talent 2 as well as her skill 2 and 3. But the best change they made is how flexible it is. While the other primals have restrictions in range or conditions for activation, for Blaze it's instant and global. Anyone who triggers burn anywhere triggers her talent. But why is this so good, and how does that affect how you use her, both as an individual unit and as part of the larger burn squad? Well, for when you're using her on her own, it means that she completely bypasses the notorious limitation of primal casters supposedly being unable to deal both elemental buildup and elemental damage at the same time. While her S1 and S2 can apply burn, as you'll see, neither of them have anything built into them to take advantage of that other than the fact that they deal arts damage and the burn status debuffs res. But because of Blaze's first talent, depending on what skill you're using, she can over double the damage that happens on a burn trigger. So while she does have to push through res to apply the burn status, unlike a unit like you or Bobbing, when she does apply that burn, it goes a lot further than it would for either of them if you were using them on their own. It also scales with her attack, which means that when you move to modes like IS, where her attack will be much higher than normal, the damage from your burn triggers will also be much higher. And again, not just to gas her up, but this is another great feature. Burn procs deal 7,000 elemental damage instantly, which is really good in any kind of normal content, but there comes a point in IS scaling where that just isn't as impactful anymore. When enemies have millions of hit points, 7,000 just doesn't mean all that much. However, when that scales with her attack, and her attack is scaled with various relics, suddenly those burn procs are a lot more meaningful. So, To keep things separate for anyone who's watching this and doesn't have you or the other burn units, when you're using her on her own, this is great and lets her bypass one of the biggest limitations of her subclass. And while she's not typically the first pick for any of the meta strats in IS at present, it does mean that she can still scale to that content when you bring her there. And that's just Talent 1. Talent 2 also has a lot going on, and makes it so that when Blaze would normally be defeated, instead of being retreated, she becomes incapacitated, remaining on the field and gaining a 6000 HP barrier, while recovering 3% or 3.5% with potential 3 of her max HP per second. This means it takes 33.3 seconds for her to recover at P1 and 28.6 seconds at P3. And then when she revives at full HP, she stuns all nearby enemies for 5 seconds. This essentially makes her a ranged Dull Keeper, and while she has some limitations that they don't, mainly that she has no way of inflicting damage during her recovery, she also has a very notable advantage as she continues to regain her SP in this state. The SP gain actually works out really nicely too, as Skill 2 and Skill 3, her main skills, have SP costs that line up really well with that downtime, and her S1 has an SP cost significantly lower than that. So while she may not be getting her autos in during that period, the second she's back up, she'll be ready to blast the stun enemies with whichever skill she has equipped. While her Talent 1 makes her strong, and don't get me wrong, this talent does that too, this one is what makes her fun and unique. As we saw a bit in her first talent, a running theme through her kit will be her flexibility. Talent 1 isn't restricted by her range and gives her a way to deal both elemental buildup and damage instead of just one or the other like people expect from primal casters. Her skill 2 and 3 have really good ranges, and her talent 2 lets her be deployed pretty much anywhere. This doesn't mean that any spot is necessarily optimal for her, as if she gets incapacitated during her skills, they get cut off, substantially reducing her effectiveness. And while a 6000 HP barrier is a lot of HP, it's not the same thing as being invincible. But even when you place her in a spot that maybe she shouldn't be on her own, you still have a chance to recover and make sure there's a healer that can cover her once she's back up, or a ground unit that can take some of the heat off of her or something, instead of her instantly being sent back and you needing to wait 70 seconds to redeploy her. And if you do place her well, there are a lot of ways that you can take advantage of this. Legitimately, it's impossible to cover every example, but let's look at a few. For one, it lets her cheese a number of mechanics. Londinium Defense Artillery, who cares, she'll be back in 30 seconds with her skill all ready to go. Playing the Babel mechanics and she's knocked down while holding another unit's chains? Doesn't matter, she wasn't retreated so the other unit's fine. Playing CCB3 at max risk and she's constantly taking damage that can instantly knock her down, but you have one of 2 units that can actually heal her during her downtime and get her back up instantly? Okay, this one's a bit niche and advanced and all, but hey, permanent stunlock. But even outside of those, it's super useful. Stressing about deployment order when you want to place a ranged unit before you place your defender? Don't worry about it, she can handle it. Placing her on her own in a lane with some ranged units? Maybe they'll incapacitate her once or twice, but she'll be back up for her skills. Enemies that deal splash damage taking out all your ranged units when they attack your ground operators? Who cares, she can take it. This talent is so great because it both raises her skill floor, letting you recover from mistakes when you're still figuring her or a stage out, and raises the skill ceiling, giving you access to something really unique and valuable that once you know how to use it, you'll be able to play around in a lot of ways. Blaze also just got her first mod on the CN server. The base effect gives her an extra damage multiplier for elemental damage dealt, and the talent change affects her first talent, increasing the instant elemental damage and healing, and giving her plus 10% attack for 10 seconds after a burn is triggered. Now, like the rest of Blaze's kit, I've seen a lot of people complaining about this mod, and I just want to say, it's a good mod. I'm also going to complain about part of it, but not the part that everyone else seems to have locked in on, but it's a good mod, and parts of it are way kinder to Blaze and her kit than it had to be. People seem to have expected it to make all of her attacks deal burn damage, or for her to bypass res when applying burn or something. But HG wasn't going to completely abandon the design philosophy of the class like that. It just wasn't happening. And as I've already suggested and will continue to suggest throughout this video, Blaze doesn't actually need that to be a good unit. I could definitely see the eventual second Primal Caster mod branch focusing more on elemental buildup, but I do not think they'll ever go that far. What I will complain about, however, is the attack boost that they added to the end of her talent. On the surface, it seems great. 10% extra attack is a huge boost for any unit, especially units like Blaze, who can use that to boost arch damage and elemental application. However, that 10% is additive with her skills. This means that with no skill active, she gets 10% extra attack, a whole 86.5 attack at max mod, potential, and level. And then, with her skills active, she also still gets 86.5 extra attack. And that's a lot less impactful when, on S2, she has over 2,000 attack than it was when she just had 865. In reality, on skill, it's not actually a 10% increase. On S2, it's closer to 4%. Still not nothing, but for a bonus that's already conditional, they really didn't have to be this conservative with how they applied it. Anyway, the positive here is that everything else works perfectly with her kit. In fact, even if that attack boost is lower than it should be, the way it applies is actually ideal for Blaze. Because her Talent 1's bonus elemental damage is instant upon triggering a burn status, they could easily have ordered all these boosts she gets from her mod such that they completely ignored that. However, they were a lot kinder than that, and both the trait change's extra multiplier and the attack she gets when a burn is triggered apply to any burn on the field, regardless of whether the attack effect was active before that. Because of that, along with the attack increase from the mod's base stats, and the fact that, oh yeah, it increases the base damage from her special burn triggers in the talent change too, that instant elemental damage increases by around 50%. This is great for her. As I've alluded to, her value proposition has always been that while she may not apply burn as quickly as units that can bypass res or anything, her burn triggers dealing twice the damage lets her still have competitive burn DPS. Now, with those burn triggers doing 50% more damage each, the value proposition becomes a lot more compelling. So while it may not fix her, heavy air quotes here by the way, it does really help solidify her value as a unit. So, if you're going to use her, I definitely recommend crafting it when it comes to global. It may not completely revolutionize her or her kit, but it'll be a worthwhile addition that really strengthens her both as an individual unit and as a support for other burn units. Now, as you can see, I have spent a lot more time going over her talents than I usually do for my reviews. There are a couple reasons for that. For one, they just have so much going on and are so important to how you play her. While a unit like Viviana appreciates the extra damage and survivability from her talents, the way those work are pretty straightforward. That is not the case for Blaze. And honestly, this is part of why I don't really blame people for not getting how strong she is. There's a lot to get, and in a gacha game, you kind of have to just plan your pulls based on your perception of a unit before you have a chance to play them for yourself. Not even mentioning the investment that it takes to actually build a unit up to the point where you can properly use them, and for a unit like Blaze where it really takes using her for her to click, that can put her in a difficult spot. But the other reason is that these talents and the utility that they bring are a huge part of what give Blaze her unique niche, and ultimately a big part of why she works well on her own and not just alongside you. While yes, the peak of her damage is locked behind an enabler unit, as we'll talk about when we go over her S3, that's not the limit of her utility. Her niche isn't just all-out elemental damage, but her durability and flexibility as enabled by her talents. And while the comparisons to units like Logos might make her damage look bad on its own, even though it isn't, it's this utility that still leaves her in a really good spot, both in the present state of the game and long term. Damage is simply the most replaceable part of any unit's kit. Every unit, minus most of the medics, do it. The way you really push advanced content is by maximizing utility while getting the necessary damage. That's why things like max risk CC aren't just always using the same squad of the top 13 highest DPS units in the game, but rather finding a combination of units that let you get the most out of the team as a whole. But this isn't just a phenomenon you see at high-level play. Think about how often you bring units like Silver Ash these days. While his damage is still respectable, especially after his cracked mod, the DPS cap has just climbed high enough that there are better options. That's because damage gets power crept a lot more easily than any special utility that a unit might bring. The DPS ceiling is always climbing, but it's much less common for them to give two units the exact same utility. This legitimately means that while a unit like Logos, that has more damage but less broad utility, is stronger now, he will likely have his use cases become more crowded as the game goes on, whereas a unit like Blaze might be more niche, but is more likely to retain that niche long term. But we still have a lot to cover, so let's keep things moving and go over her skills. Blaze's first skill targets the operator with the highest max HP in her range, herself included, and puts a circular field around them that deals 70% of her attack as arts damage and 30% of that arts damage as burn to all enemies within that field. It's really good for a 6-star first skill. With just a mastery or two, it gets to 100% uptime, it deals solid, consistent damage, and it's surprisingly good at applying burn. Plus, like we went over, the burns that it triggers are extra strong because of her first talent. But personally, I still don't really like it for her. It's not so much that it's bad, but more that it just doesn't really work with the rest of her kit. For one, while it still benefits from her first talent, it doesn't have any kind of attack increase, meaning it doesn't scale that extra damage beyond its base level. But what's more is that Blaze's kit is so much about flexibility, and this skill just doesn't have that. Not only does it lack the hugely extended ranges of S2 and S3, but it also typically only ever centers on one of your units. The only way to change its targeting is to either retreat the current highest HP unit or deploy another with higher HP. Admittedly, sometimes that's okay. Because it surrounds the targeted unit, it'll always cover their lane. But again, with how much room there is for skill expression and creativity in what you do with Blaze's kit, it feels wrong to have a skill be this rigid in its targeting. That said, if you do plan on using it, I highly recommend you give it masteries. This is true for all of Blaze's skills, by the way, and not unique to her S1, but her masteries here are what let her gain the 100% uptime, as well as give her 27% extra arts damage and burn buildup. And because of the way that double dips, it makes a pretty big impact on how it performs. Blaze's S2 is typically her main skill, particularly when you're using her on her own. Her attack range expands to Carnelian or Lyn S3 range, her attack interval increases, her attack increases by 150%, and she now attacks 3 enemies at once, but loses 5% of her HP with each attack. And when she attacks, she leaves behind a pool of her burning blood that reduces enemy movement speed by 50% and inflicts 35% of Blaze's attack as arts damage per second, and 30% of that arts damage as burn damage. And it has nearly 50% uptime to boot. Now, that's a lot, but you might have caught 2 negative effects within all of that. But before you sound the alarms, they actually work out pretty well for her. First of all, the self-inflicted damage isn't as bad as it sounds. For one, because of the increase in her attack interval, she can only get 14 attacks in per skill activation, meaning she is incapable of knocking herself out in one skill. Plus, with her healing off of burns and the skill being pretty solid at inflicting those on enemies that don't explode to her damage early, she can sustain herself pretty well overall. And if they do explode right away, well, it probably wasn't that difficult of a stage anyway, and it won't really matter if she's down for 30 seconds. The other negative effect is lengthening her attack interval. This can have a huge impact on DPS for a lot of units, but it's not as bad for Blaze. The main reason for this is the burning pools she leaves behind. Those actually inflict damage much faster than her regular, unaltered attack interval, and because they scale off of her attack, they still get to benefit from the skill's increased stats. It ends up being a really great option for dealing with crowds and elites at the same time. For crowds of trash mobs, while hitting 3 enemies at once is already pretty good, the fact that the burn pools don't have a target limit means that no matter how many enemies are coming in, she can get them all. The movement speed reduction from those pools is also really helpful for her spreading those too. Once she attacks an enemy, they'll be slowed, meaning that if there are enemies in another lane in her, again, really wide range, they might pass the initial targets and end up being closer to their blue box than them, letting her switch over to targeting them instead, and in doing so, spreading the pools further. While this might mean she doesn't necessarily end up attacking the same enemy throughout her skill duration, it doesn't hamper her ability to deal with larger threats either. The burn pools are a pretty significant part of her damage, and her ability to inflict not only burn procs, but burn procs boosted by her first talent means that anything that's on them for a few seconds will probably be evaporated before long. Now, as this is her main skill for applying burn damage, it's impossible to talk about it without comparing it to units like you and bobbing. Blaze has to push through things like res and damage reduction while they can apply their status directly, and yeah, in a lot of cases they can apply burn much faster than she can. But there are still cases where even just looking at damage and ignoring all the other things Blaze has going for her, like again, her flexibility, her range, her crowd control, her survivability, she still has better burn damage. And here things get complicated. For starters, I just want to say that while she takes a bit longer than units that can apply the status directly, she's still very competent at doing so, being able to apply 2 burn triggers in one skill against elites with up to 60 res, which is going to cover the majority of enemies you encounter. But the thing to remember with her burn triggers is that 1, she has her talent 1 boosting their elemental damage, and 2, that talent scales off of her attack, and 3, this skill over doubles her attack. I'll save you the math and do the work for you. This means that when maxed out on her own, her burn statuses deal twice the damage as those other units, and that only gets better when she gets her mod. And considering you and bobbing don't have any way of dealing elemental damage to units under burn statuses, that's a really big difference. This means that even when she takes longer to apply the status, she can ultimately have a much higher burn DPS than those units. Let's look at an example. Say there's an enemy with 60 res. You and Blaze are both maxed out and on their S2s, each of their main skills when you don't have a team supporting them. I said 60 res is the limit for Blaze being able to inflict 2 burn triggers per skill, so she can't be that effective there, right? Well, let's see. Yu applies his first burn trigger after only 2.99 seconds. That's really fast. Blaze, meanwhile, takes 12.16 seconds. Yu wins, right? Sure, Blaze's burn triggers deal over twice as much damage, but here she takes way more than twice as long to apply it. Well, that's true, but Blaze still ends up dealing more elemental damage here. While Yu takes only 2.99 seconds to build up the status, he still has to wait the full 10 seconds before he can apply it again. So it's not just 2.99 seconds times 2, it's 2.99 seconds times 2 plus 10 seconds. This means that it would take him 15.98 seconds to get there. Suddenly, Blaze's 12.16 seconds doesn't seem so bad. Now, this isn't to say that Blaze is just better than Yu. Yu is still a very good unit, and in cases where enemy HP is low enough that he can take them out within 1 normal burn trigger, that extra damage from Blaze just doesn't matter. Plus, against enemies with heavy damage reduction, and against bosses who have a doubled elemental HP bar, Blaze S2 can still struggle. But there are also cases, especially in content where enemy HP inflates, for example IS, but also in regular content where elites just have more HP than that, where his 7,000 damage with no modifiers just isn't as impactful on its own. But this isn't a full comparison either. The fact is that Yu and Blaze are 2 very different units with very different strengths. They don't actually fill the same role at all, and I don't want to give people the idea that, oh, you don't need Yu, you should just use Blaze, because Yu has things that Blaze can't do, just like Blaze has things that Yu can't do. That's why I didn't even bother to factor in the respective arts damage. But I wanted to talk about this because this is one of the ways that people tend to criticize Blaze. She's pointless, she just has to deal with enemy res, you can bypass it, so he's better, you should just use him instead. That's not the full truth. Just like Yu has cases where he's the better fit, so does Blaze. But we're not done talking about her kit either. She still has her S3, and for all my posturing on the last one about how she didn't need a unit enabling her, this is the skill that gave her that reputation. Blaze's S3 gives her 25 ammo to start, and it gives her 2 more whenever an enemy is affected by a burn trigger. It changes her range to be this sort of diamond shape, increases her attack, greatly reduces her attack interval, and gives her attacks AoE, makes her lose 3% of her max HP per second, and when a target is under the burn effect, she deals extra elemental damage as a portion of her attack. And no, this does not have any way of applying burn damage on its own. Now, I hope I've already done a bit to dispel the myth that she specifically needs you to function by showing that she has a really nice S2 that works really well on its own, because straight up, this one's going to be a bit harder to argue for. Though, right off the bat, I do want to say that in at least 80 to 90% of situations, it'll be fine on its own. In casual stages like regular events, EX stages, and S stages, as well as things like low to mid difficulty IS, it's fine. It'll still take out enemies no problem, and honestly pairing it with you or another source of burn damage would probably just be overkill, and you'd be better served using that roster slot for something else. And in a lot of cases where it's not enough on its own, you don't even need to pair it with burn damage. With a res debuffer like Ifrit, even without her burn mod, she can still take out pretty much any enemy or boss you'll encounter normally, even everyone's go-to measuring stick, Patriot. So, if you want to know how it works for her when she's the only burn unit, there you go. It's solid, but most of the time I'd recommend S2 over it if you don't have anyone to enable the bonuses she gets. But to get to know how it works in a team environment, when do you need someone to apply burn for her S3, and does it need to be you? Elemental damage really shines in situations where your regular damage would be too heavily reduced to take out the target. This can be cases of high defense and res, but either debuffing, ignoring resistance, or getting such high physical damage per hit that it no longer matters, often are more flexible or practical ways around that. Where it really excels is in cases where the mechanics prevent those from being feasible, most notably things like damage reduction or dodge. It isn't the only way to deal with those things, and for every time these mechanics come up, they have ways of dealing with them cooked into that event as well. But things like elemental damage can give you a lot more control over how you approach a stage in a way that can really help. To go to the examples I showed on screen, sure, you could wait for the cannon to hit Manfred, or the altars to reach the Sanguinarch. Or you could just burst them down with elemental damage and remove them from the picture entirely so that you can clean up the rest of the stage more easily. So, while it's not typically a necessary tool, strictly speaking, it'd be kind of messed up if it was, it's a really powerful one, and one where we still don't have that many units who can take advantage of it. That last part really restricts how we put together those synergies, and it's why a lot of people think Yu is the only enabler for Blaze. But while he might be the best in a lot of scenarios, he is not the only option. For one, bobbing, the 5-star ritualist, is surprisingly effective. His skill 2 has AoE, so he can get plenty of triggers per skill activation, boosting Blaze's HP, ammo, and damage. And he has a quick enough rotation that he'll always be ready for the next Blaze S3. He has no problem inflicting burn to any elite that comes by, but it is worth noting that with the doubled elemental HP bar that bosses get, he can still struggle to apply burn to them within one S2 activation. For that, he needs to be M3, Mod 3, Potential 5, yes, that is a requirement, and at least level 68. Otherwise, he will stop just painfully shy of triggering it and will need to wait for the next skill activation. And yeah, his S1 isn't doing it either. But if you have him there or are just dealing with elites and not bosses, he's genuinely a really solid option. And the second you step into any kind of buffing scenario like IS, those requirements go out the window and he'll just be inflicting burn with his auto attacks. Plus, if you're specifically looking for IS, he's a 5-star, so he'll be a lot cheaper to recruit and promote than the other options. Viviana works pretty well too. Her S3 is single target but focuses on elites and bosses, so while she won't be getting as many triggers at once like bobbing, she'll trigger the effect on the enemies that actually matter. Meanwhile, Blaze's AoE will have no problem dealing with any of the trash mobs that don't get burnt. Plus, Vivi's skill cycle also works pretty well with Blaze's, and she can take advantage of the burn burst by dealing elemental damage as well, rather than just applying the status and then kind of sitting there while Blaze takes care of the rest, which is unique among all the burn units that are practical pairings with Blaze, leaving her to provide more damage than any of the other possible pairings. However, while she is very good at applying burn against pretty much any res threshold, as I talk about in my previous video, which you should totally watch, she still gets impacted by things like damage reduction. While this leaves her as a really good option for a lot of situations, and maybe the go-to choice for when you just want to burst down anything that doesn't have damage reduction or dodge, as I said previously, there are a lot more options for dealing with those sorts of enemies. So, is this a competent and effective duo? Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, they'd be overkill for pretty much anything in regular content. But are they revolutionary? Not quite. And then there's Yu. Yu is another really complicated unit with a lot going on, and I'm already way too deep into breaking down Blaze to get fully into it. But he has some options for working with Blaze. While it's not the combo that everyone thinks of, his S2 makes for a competent burn enabler, and on his own it's his main skill. It teleports enemies to him and lets him apply burn to anyone he's blocking, and boy does he apply it quickly. However, he needs to be blocking them, and he only gets that teleport once per skill activation. So there are times when Blaze will just end up using a bunch of her ammo on enemies as they approach before they can actually be burnt by Yu. And any really big threats, like bosses that get blocked by Yu, can still take him out. He's tanky, but he's not invincible. But it's still a solid option if you plan on using it to gather the big threats you need Blaze to take out, and then activating Blaze, especially since both of their skill rotations work reasonably well together. But S2 isn't what people usually use to enable burn for other units. Instead, they use the much flashier S3. Yu's S3 creates a big wall of fire and lets anyone who deals arts damage through that wall inflict burn damage as a portion of his attack. This has the obvious advantage of letting Blaze inflict burn herself, both to her main target and to anything hit by the splash damage. No needing to work around ranges or blocking or target count, and since it applies that burn damage as a portion of Yu's attack with each hit, the fact that her S3 reduces her attack interval lets her apply it pretty quickly too. But this combo still has its quirks. For one, while Yu's S3 lasts long enough that you sometimes manage to get 2 Blaze S3s per Yu activation, it also has an even longer downtime, meaning you'll have at least as many without it. Though that's not necessarily a deal breaker either. I mean, this combo is already something that's overkill for anything but the most extreme bosses, so you probably don't need it for every single activation on the stage. Once you've used the first activation to deal with the boss, well, Blaze will be just fine dealing with elites and trash mobs without the extra burn damage. But lately, the more common thing I've seen is people suggesting that Blaze isn't even the best pairing for US3. While I don't think she necessarily universally is, no one is, that's the beauty of this game, it's absolutely worth noting that none of the other options you'll see in showcases can actually deal elemental damage. They can take advantage of the reduced res, and the flat 7,000 damage from the burn trigger is nice, but they can't do anything with it beyond that. So, in cases where you're just trying to debuff res, and that's the only form of damage reduction that enemies have, or you have a bunch of enemies with high res and low HP, sure, use your drone casters or whatever. Yeah, using Yu to get around that isn't the only option, and honestly probably isn't even the most practical one, but it is a fun one, and honestly that does count for a lot. But in cases where res isn't the only source of damage reduction, aka the situations where you really want to use elemental damage in the first place, Blaze is by far the best pick, as she can bypass those entirely. And there are a lot more bosses with damage reduction or dodge than there are bosses with 90 res. But the other thing to consider is that none of these options are actually used in much advanced content. There are no CC records using it, no crazy IS, multi-ending, no relic strats that I'm aware of. Yu's already been out for 6 months on CN, and his S3 has only 4 records on ArcRec. Blaze's S3, a skill that supposedly only works with Yu S3, has almost 6 times that many. and for the record, her S2 has almost 3 times as many as that. In the end, this combo is just one option for dealing with damage, and damage, like I said earlier, is the most replaceable part of any unit's kit. I mean, that's why I think Blaze S2 is legitimately the better option over her S3. It just has more to offer unless you play around the weird quirks of her kit, the things that no other operator can do, a lot more effectively than her S3. And while I think it's fair to criticize her S3 for not letting you take advantage of the full kit without pairing her with other units, I also think that's totally fine and doesn't hamper her as a unit overall. For one, there are a lot of good 6 stars where people only ever use 1 or 2 skills. You never see anyone complaining about Aya Altar having a mostly useless S2 because no one uses it, they just take another skill. Same with Ling S1. You could say it's a worse S3, or you could use S3 and forget that S1 exists. And 2, I actually like when units encourage synergies. It encourages you to change up your squad and your strategies in ways that you might never have tried otherwise. And that kind of variety in the gameplay keeps things fresh, even when you've played the game for tens if not hundreds of hours. This is not a case of there only being one mandatory pairing, but rather one possibility that can push you to mix things up and try something new. But while I've tried to highlight that Blaze works well on her own with her S1 and especially her S2, and honestly even her S3 when it's normal content, and the fact that while Yu is a very strong enabler for her S3, he's decidedly not the only one, there's another side to all of this. As much as Blaze can benefit from the other burn units, it's not a one-way synergy. Think about the other burn units for a sec. While Blaze's S3 only applies elemental damage to enemies under the burn effect, Yu and Bombing have no way of applying elemental damage once the burn effect has been triggered on any of their skills. So if that enemy isn't taken out by the 7k damage from that trigger, well, there's nothing they can really do about it but wait for it to come around again. For Bombing, this means that there are a lot of enemies that he just can't deal with on his own, and for Yu, it means that those enemies, often the biggest threats, will stay blocked for much longer than you'd like, taking up his block count and potentially putting him in danger without another unit to help clear them out. But if you more than double the burn damage they deal by Blaze just existing somewhere on the field, well, suddenly they can deal with a lot more enemies a lot better. Add her mod to that when it releases for the global server and bam, that only becomes stronger. And even Viviana, a unit that can apply both elemental buildup and elemental damage, can still benefit greatly from Blaze. Vivi can apply up to 3 burn triggers per S3 activation on a single target. That's already a lot of damage, but now imagine each of those doing more than 7k extra damage, or over 10k each with Blaze's mod. Like, that's just a wild thing to be able to bring to the table with 0 restrictions. It doesn't need to be in her range, she doesn't need to attack the enemies, nothing. All she needs to do is exist and boom, over 30,000 extra elemental damage per skill on a single target. And this is all without factoring in Blaze actually attacking or anything. She still has her S2 if you want her doing her own damage and crowd control, and she has her S3 for situations where her talent just isn't enough elemental damage on its own. So to me, it's less that Blaze needs these other units to function, she's just fine on her own, and more that with Blaze, these other units really get to shine. I'd stop just shy of saying that they need her, but like, it's close. And this is what makes Blaze so special. There isn't just one way to use her. In spite of her reputation, she isn't so much limited by your roster, but rather only by your imagination. You could use a burn unit to support her, sure, or you could use her to support them, or you could use her durability to give you a bit more flexibility as you try a new stage, or you could bypass some mechanics, or you could use her to support multiple lanes with her extended ranges, or any of these at the same time, or so many other things. Her pairing with burn units is something that definitely raises her power ceiling, but it doesn't lower her power floor as much as people would have you think. She's one of those units that may not hard carry you through every stage, though her damage is still solid. But if you have her in your back pocket, you'll be able to find some crazy way of using her that no other unit could replicate. That, to me, is what makes a unit great. both being flexible and being capable of things that no other unit can do. And really, there's no one quite like Blaze. Hey, thanks for watching. This one ended up taking a bit longer than I'd planned. No joke, I had 12,000 words written between all my drafts, and then they went and dropped the Primal Caster mods. So this may not be early enough to inform your polls on her debut banner, but hopefully it can be helpful if you got her and are still deciding whether or not to build her. Also, I just wanted to shout out the Shadow of Babel here on YouTube. I don't have a CN account, so I was just going to have to go off of numbers alone for her mod, but they let me test her out a bit, and even invested mod blocks in doing so, which, like, huge. And without that, I would not have been able to test out exactly how it worked, and this would not have been possible otherwise. Go give them a sub. They do a lot of great clears and have covered a lot of niches, and were even the only person to play Litanian Knights before me. Oh yeah, and also sub to me, I guess. Forgot that part. Whoops.